Okay, it's recording?
Yep.
Okay. Tonight's topic is, what is the relevance of 1917 to the present? Before I get into our topic, I would first like to say something about who we are and what we do. Platypus is an educational project of and for the left. Through self-criticism of the left's understanding of its history and its present activity, we aim for the reconstitution of a Marxian left. We emphasize the absence, that is, the lack of political force, of any such left in the present. Hence our slogan, "The left is dead, long live the left." Even in the absence of a left today, its historical tasks still continue to haunt us. What is the left? Today, the answer to this question can appear unclear. It appears unclear because of historical reasons. In particular, because the left has suffered a long history of sequential defeats. Initially, historically, the left emerged during the French Revolution. Its primary orientation was around freedom. Today, this concept, freedom, might be confused with something right-wing. In common parlance, the left is often taken to mean the Democratic Party. This is not what we mean when we discuss the historical left. But that's the rub. We have to describe the left in the negative, according to what it is not. It is not a position or series of positions on specific political issues. It is not an uncritical adherence to the theses of this or that thinker. It is least of all a set of tactics. The left is a historical project of transformation and emancipation. It is, to borrow a phrase from Karl Marx, the ruthless critique of everything existing. And not only that, through this ruthless critique of everything existing, the left has sought to change the world. When mythologies take hold, when man is subordinated to what appears as external forces, whether divine, natural, or social, this subordination is, to the left, something rooted in human social practice and can be comprehended and changed to better align with the needs and wants of our species. It is this sensibility which has receded into memory. And this retreat is precisely what we refer to as the death of the left. Platypus seeks a wider, more broad, more abstract, and more historical understanding of the left. We do this not out of academicism or to be esoteric, but because we are interested in how the historical left can appear far more radical than the left politics available to us in the present. To us, all bets are off, as far as analyses and positions in the present go. It is for this reason that we host fora on left issues with an open-ended mandate on what is included in the left. This is not out of inclusivity for its own sake, but to open up disagreements and sites of contestation. The death of the historical left might be considered a liability. We take it as an asset, an opportunity to learn from the left's failures in the past century. In order to render this history of defeats as a critical experience, to learn in earnest from the dead left, to brush history against the grain, we host public fora panel events, publish the Platypus Review, which is open submission, and by the way, free copies available in the back right there. Take as many as you want. And run regular reading groups and coffee breaks on university campuses internationally.
The reading group for New York, we meet on Monday nights from 8 to 10 p.m. At 19 University Place, and coffee breaks are Tuesdays at 6 p.m. at Kopi, which is like right over there.
And also for the reading groups, along with the Platypus reviews, we have posters with the reading group schedules, list of readings, and when they have to be read. So, to continue, 2 questions already haunt our inquiry of 1917. What is socialism? What is Marxism? These directly relate to our topic, because the Russian Revolution of 1917 is thought of as the socialist, the Marxist revolution. Rather than consider the success of the historical left, today we are forced to examine a history of failure. Some on the left today see 1917 as the greatest success of socialism. To the contemporaries of the Russian Revolution, this might have seemed so. To us, though, it appears to have been a failure that has been unmatched and unmet for 100 years. But the fact that it ended in failure does not negate its historical importance. This is a failure from which we are tasked to learn. We are here to discuss the Russian Revolution of 1917 and its legacy in the present. But as students of Marxism, we've learned that the great cataclysms of modern history are never so sudden as they may seem. The conditions for the new are set by the old. Just as the course of our own human evolution was set by our ancestral apes before our species struck out on its own, the emergence of the left, of socialism, of Marxism, is the product of the society from which it emerged, from bourgeois society. Bourgeois society itself emerged from the age of monarchy, birthed by the merchants of Italy and Flanders in the 15th century. The bourgeoisie dislodged labor and wealth from their feudal bonds in 1789, seized political power by overthrowing the aristocracy in the French Revolution. While it may be popular, even easy today, to roundly condemn the entire bourgeois class, we must remember that they were once the class of revolution and liberation. They freed labor from land, peasant from lord, thought from church. They're great thinkers, Descartes, Kant, Hegel, introduced with great urgency the hitherto unthought concept of human freedom. Freedom in bourgeois society is the freedom to labor and to exchange that labor and its products freely. It demands the political form of representative democracy, as well as the full recognition of the equality and rights of man. Freedom could be realized in and through society, on its basis, from the political freedom of a nation to determine its own way of life, to the development of a universal humanity in which all men belong, and the nations of the world engage in peaceful, competitive cooperation instead of war. Even the state, as separate from, rising above, and dominating civil society, was to be subordinated to it, to be a form functioning by and for the people. With the Industrial Revolution, this came into crisis as machines and the application of the forces of nature replaced direct human labor as a source of use values, of wealth. The alien forces of capital came to dominate humanity, reducing the capitalist to a parasite whose power was more apparent than real, and increasingly turning the rest of humanity into a formally free but really enslaved labor force, the proletariat. In short, the bourgeoisie failed to deliver the very freedom their revolution had set out to achieve. They could not. They had once been the masters of capital, but as their industrial revolution took hold, capital became the master of all. Bourgeois society found itself in crisis, and it is that crisis that we call capitalism. In response to this emerging crisis, the proletariat organized to demand a new social organization which served humanity rather than capital. A new problem and a new task had emerged: the proletarian socialist revolution, which would require the political leadership of the proletariat. Socialism is a response to capitalism in the crisis of bourgeois society, and thus, as a politics, it is immanent to capitalism. That is, it is the product of capitalism, as much as it might signal its end. It is the demand for liberation from the total domination of capital in order to free humans from drudgery, further the development of our social productive forces, and create the ground for a higher level of social and individual freedom. Marxism is a self-consciousness and self-critique of proletarian socialism as it emerged in the 19th century. Socialism predates Marx. Contrary to popular belief, he was not its champion, but its greatest critic. He viewed the socialist experiments of the early 19th century as partial and necessarily failed attempts to organize the tasks of human freedom. It is very curious how liberal projects, starting with the French Revolution, often became so illiberal. Indeed, this was one of the major observations of Marxism, a theory of the contradictory historical progress of society and the working class as the developing agent of politics. There is a great deal of intervening history between the beginning of Marxism in 1917, which we just don't have time to get into right now. In the Platypus reading group, we read the primary texts of the canonical debates of Marxism, from its founding moments to the central debates of the First and Second Internationals, and also of the Third and to a lesser extent Fourth Internationals, dealing with the growth and rise of the left in the 19th and the fragmentation and death of the left in the 20th century. I mention these here only to give words to a history that I'm skipping for time. But for this talk now, I want to focus on the moments leading up to 1917. Two key moments do need to be mentioned for historical context, however: 1848 and 1905. 1848 saw failed bourgeois democratic revolutions across Europe, most notably in France. In France, the proletariat failed to lead society, and no other class proved capable of doing so. The outcome was the coup d'etat of Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. What Marx took from 1848 was that the bourgeois democratic revolution, in the sense of the Great French Revolution of 1789, had come into self-contradiction and crisis. The discontents of capitalism wanted democracy in one nation, but democracy in one nation ended in subordination to the forces of international capital. For the democratic revolution to succeed, it would have to be socialist and international. This was something that was key to the theory and practice of Lenin and other Second International socialists leading up to 1917. 1905 saw what Leon Trotsky describes as the dress rehearsal to October, a series of strikes, demonstrations, and suppressions that culminated in a failed insurrection against the Tsar. What was significant about 1905 for us is the emergence of a form of organization that would play a decisive role in 1917, the Soviet, made up of representatives elected by the masses and striking workers of Petrograd. The Soviet directed revolutionary efforts during the 1905 revolution. The year 1917 in Russia had many revolutionary advances and retreats. The two key revolutionary periods were February and October. what led from February to October? For most of the 20th century, the accepted view, following both Stalin and Cold War anti-communists, said that February, when the Tsar was forced to abdicate and the provisional government was formed, was the democratic revolution, and October was the socialist revolution, or even the Bolshevik revolution. The implication is that the formation of the provisional government expressed the will of the Russian people, and that October was an illegitimate coup. In fact, matters are more complicated. The provisional government was not the only thing to come out of February. All across Russia, councils of workers' and soldiers' deputies, the Soviets, emerged. The masses elected representatives to these Soviets, and often followed orders given by the Soviets. Had the Soviets taken power in February, then February would have been the democratic revolution. But the Soviets did not take power in February, instead giving it to the provisional government. The Soviets elected Menshevik and socialist revolutionary deputies who empowered the bourgeois liberal cadets in the provisional government. From the beginning, the provisional government sought to suppress the Soviets. And from the beginning, the Soviets, under Menshevik and socialist revolutionaries, sought to subordinate themselves to the provisional government. Lenin, however, saw potential in the Soviets. Before 1917, it was unclear what form of organization the proletariat and the masses would need to smash the capitalist state and capitalist resistance and appropriate the means of production. With the Soviets, however, Lenin saw a potential that few others immediately grasped. Both ultra-democratic and showing how the masses might be organized for the conscious restructuring of society, the Soviets pointed beyond capitalism. Because of this, they were incompatible with the provisional government, which, like any capitalist state, was tasked with keeping social conflicts within bourgeois boundaries. The two governments came into irreconcilable conflicts. It was this divided state that Lenin referred to as the dual power. Because Lenin saw potential, and because he energetically tasked the Bolshevik Party with realizing that potential, the Bolsheviks were able to gain ground as mass demonstrations, social disorders, and even an abortive insurrection led the cadets, SRs, and Mensheviks to be discredited. The Bolsheviks did not try to seize power in April, and even stopped the Petrograd masses from an attempted insurrection in July, but let the provisional government exhaust itself, and patiently explained to the masses the need to overthrow the provisional government, until, gradually but massively, the masses came to them. Then, in September and October, after an attempted counter-revolutionary coup stripped the provisional government of the last legitimacy it had, the time came to strike. During the internal crisis of the Bolshevik Party immediately before they decided to seize the power for the Soviets, Lenin's opponents tried to bait the Bolsheviks. They asked, "Can you really do what you claim to want to do and take responsibility for the whole of society?" Lenin took this as an opportunity to clarify what it would mean for the Soviets to take all power. The Soviets could take responsibility for transforming society by laying hold of the apparatus that capitalism has already created: banks, syndicates, the postal service, consumer societies, and office employees' unions. And ordinary workers would lead this. The Bolsheviks resolved to take power, organized for the task, and on the night of October 25th seized the power by armed insurrection in Petrograd. This, the October Revolution, was the actual democratic revolution. The provisional government was dissolved and power was given to the Soviets. Initially, there was universal suffrage, free speech and press, and multi-party competition. The Bolsheviks never opposed these for more than immediate tactical reasons up to this point and for a time after. Although many socialists criticized the Bolsheviks for breaking up the Constituent Assembly, the dissolution of that assembly was not a repudiation of liberalism or the democratic revolution, but a necessary step for its fulfillment. The Soviets were the democracy. For the socialist revolution to succeed, it must be international. As German revolutionary Rosa Luxemburg once put it, the October Revolution posed a question that could not be answered in Russia. Why? Because capitalism is international. It permeates all peoples and all countries. A nation cannot simply opt out of this fundamental global reality. A look at any of today's so-called communist countries proves this fact. The October Revolution was national insofar as it was a democratic bourgeois revolution. But as we have already seen from 1848, a democratic bourgeois revolution, in the sense of the French Revolution, now pointed beyond itself to the task of the world socialist revolution. Lenin and Trotsky acted upon the reasonable conclusion that revolution was imminent across Europe. Strikes, mutinies, abortive formations of Soviets throughout 1917 and 1918 underlie this assertion, and the actual collapse of the Austro-Hungarian and German governments with the end of the war showed that this was by no means an unreasonable inference. But the revolutions in Europe failed, and the Russian counter-revolution unleashed a horrific, large-scale, and long-lasting civil war in Russia. Temporary tactical concessions, such as restricting the franchise and banning opposition parties and internal Bolshevik factions, as well as paying specialists higher wages, became unshakable at the risk of the Soviets being overthrown. Russia arrived into the early 1920s broken, impoverished, and isolated, and this was what led to the later triumph of the Stalinist one-party dictatorship. The partial and very limited victory of 1917 was inflated when Stalin proclaimed socialism in one state some years later, and thus betrayed October. 1917 is one of several dates that haunt the left today, like 1789, 1848, 1968, even 1989. A false assurance exists around 1917, equally for those who treat its legacy as a model, and those who, as Luxemburg noted, treat it as a question. Looking back on the history of the left throughout the 20th century, it seems that Lenin does not explain the world we live in. Bolshevism has not been vindicated, and the art of politics continues to be liquidated by the left itself. Nonetheless, 1917's unanswered questions continue to enthrall us. Today, there are two dominant understandings of 1917. First, that it was doomed to failure from the start, that the Bolsheviks should never have taken power, that Stalinist tyranny, the totalitarian one-party state that emerged after the revolution and undermined the international revolution in the coming decades, was the necessary and only possible outcome to the October Revolution. The second understanding, on the other hand, treats 1917 as another desperate act of resistance by the oppressed people, defeated because the enemy was stronger. And it just so happens that when fighting the powers that be, the enemy is always stronger. Underlying both understandings is the belief that what Lenin, Trotsky, and others were fighting for, the world socialist revolution, was not actually possible. This way of telling history points to surrender to the given and the affirmation of the present as the best of all possible worlds. Both of these dominant understandings are essentially conservative. But is there another way of looking at 1917? Is there reason to think that the tasks set by the revolutionaries were achievable? That the judgment of Lenin, Trotsky, and Luxemburg was no mere delusional utopianism, but sober judgment based on concrete historical circumstances? Were the potentials they saw in their historical situation that society could, ought to, and must be fundamentally changed mere chimeras, as their enemies in their own time and virtually everyone today maintain? Or was there something to them? In other words, is there a critical history of the Russian Revolution? The figure of Lenin, in particular, has become a locus of antinomies, misunderstandings, and disagreements. Lenin is seen as the most political Marxist, and he is either lauded or denounced for just that. Lenin confounds us today because we can't grasp politics as a dialectic of theory and practice in the present, as the mediation of means and ends in the struggle for socialism. Stalinism liquidated politics by replacing struggle with inevitability. The Marxists adopted what Walter Benjamin called faith in progress, an attitude that trusted that the proletarian revolution would inevitably occur and win solely based on the economic movement of society. That one just had to wait out capitalism and then be thrust into power by the course of events. In defeat, Marxists abandoned the ruthless critique of everything existing for blind faith. This affects us today. If Marxists have sought to understand the world not how it is, but how it could and should be, critically, how could it change? How it could change, then the absence of any attempt to change the world in the present is problematic for our ability to understand the world as Marxists. For a Marxist, to understand the world is to understand how to change it. And through the task of changing the world, it is better understood. Theory and practice are inextricably linked. There can be no one without the other. We don't know how radical we are or how radical you are. The point for Lenin was to be as radical as reality itself. Today, it is not clear that Lenin's judgment was justified. The Soviets did not take power in Germany in 1919, nor anywhere else. The civil war after the October Revolution, as I've mentioned, devastated Russia and set the stage for Stalinism. Blinded by the actual outcome, we have forgotten why historical actors like Lenin thought that things could be otherwise. The most striking thing to me, as I learn about the Russian Revolution, is how sober, how careful Lenin was in his writings and activity. Ultimately, and this is hardly a surprising answer to anybody, we cannot conclude that what Lenin, Luxemburg, and Trotsky were fighting for a century ago is possible. All 1917 showed is that an oppressed class can take and hold power in a country collapsing during a time of war. It tells us little, if anything, about the feasibility of socialism. We cannot legitimately conclude today, on the basis of a revolution that occurred a century ago, that there is anything inevitable about socialism. But Platypus is not about such conclusions. Instead, we are here because we think that we cannot conclude that what Lenin, Luxemburg, and Trotsky fought for was impossible, or that it is impossible today. This forces us to reckon with the possibility that the world as it is today is not how it always had to be or how it must be. We look back at 1917 as a moment at which things could have been otherwise, and we seek to learn from it today. What do you think? Is there anything still to learn from 1917? What can it say to the present? What aspects of the present are in most desperate need of clarification?
I'd like to know more about, between the times of the February October Revolution, perhaps a little after, just direct action from working class people setting up autonomous societies around Russia. How did those come to collapse? How did those come to not succeed?
The economic societies? You mean this?
I'm talking more in like the, Berkman talks a lot about how there were societies that would kind of operate entirely out of provision and just, try to function, kind of anarchistically or autonomously. Were those just societies that just came to crumble due to the Russian Civil War? Or I don't know. I'd like to know more about those, I guess.
I mean, I have to be honest, I'm not especially familiar with that topic, so...
Well, then maybe I want to open discussion to what, in the future, what is the possibility or what is the likelihood that revolution, future leftism will come about through autonomous direct action as exemplified through societies like the EZLN, as exemplified through like Exarchia in Greek and autonomous zones around Europe.
I'm of the personal opinion that it's not particularly likely. One of the lessons from the 19th century for Marxists was that the political party is necessary as an organizing principle and in order to provide the slogans and leadership for the proletariat. This is not to say that the political party is the same thing as the proletariat. In fact, the political party can sometimes be an obstacle, but the necessity of the party was a fundamental lesson, and unless historical circumstances have changed extremely drastically, it's likely that that lesson still applies. Yes?
I mean, another way to sort of answer that is that shortly after the revolution, Germans occupied, a good part of the productive area of the country, including the main food-producing areas, and then there were conditions of civil war. The economy completely broke down, and during that period, it was possible in local areas for producers, peasants, really, to support themselves. But the division of labor within Russia had been such that the cities were dependent on food supplies from all these areas. So pretty quickly, basically, conditions of starvation existed in all the major cities. Like millions of people were on the verge of starvation. Millions of people did die. So the government, which considered itself to represent the workers, including in rural areas, but especially in the cities, right, went out and requisitioned food. So that ultimately, in the conditions of the Civil War, the Bolsheviks couldn't allow for these autonomous communities to function as that way, because that's not a modern society. Like Russia couldn't have supported its population on the basis of, as admirable as might be to think of living in some kind of isolated rural place and governing themselves. It couldn't happen. And had they continued that way, they just would have been overrun by the white armies and subjected to basically an equivalent of fascism. So they didn't have a way out of authoritarianism through the kind of autonomous practices that they were trying to adopt. At least that's my reading of history.
All right.
Yeah.
I understand. I understand that in a lot of ways how, I kind of world that they still have the ability to autonomously raise themselves. But so maybe what lessons can we learn from that kind of organization that I think is very admirable? That you know the I mean, like, how are zones in Europe, autonomous zones in Europe, places like Exarchia and autonomous zones across France and Spain, these are in areas that are very developed, per se. I mean, I think maybe we don't...
They are or not?
They are developed. They are developed. They're very developed places. Exarchia just gave free Wi-Fi access to all of their residents, which, you know, I don't know what exactly that indicates. But, you know, what lessons can we learn from that? How are these communities able to provide sustenance for their societies inside a modern capitalistic developed city environment? I think that's an important lesson that we should be able to learn from these type of societies. That's just my point. I personally don't know how they do it, but I think it's very admirable what they do.
I mean, I think they're bastions of resistance. I certainly defend them and support them. Like Exarchia, you know, is a center for resisting, among other things, fascists in Greece, right? And that's important. But it's not self-sufficient, right? It can provide certain free services to a lot of people there, and that's, you know, it's great. But ultimately, it's not going to be able to influence the politics of Greece, and the politics of Greece are going to decide what happens to the people in Exarchia. Or like, I mean, the Zapatistas, like Zapata, you know, was in Mexico City. Like, he was in a position to rule, but he didn't have any technique, he didn't have any way of implementing an actual socialist revolution or any kind of, like, you know, thorough, deep revolution in Mexico. So ultimately, he just had to hand over power to, you know, the reactionary generals. So, you know, and that's why ultimately the areas that you know, in southern Mexico now have these oppressive conditions, why the government, you know, sends its police in, and the military and all this stuff, because they didn't actually win that revolution either. But, like, you know, Marxists who have commented on the Mexican Revolution would say, like, well, compared to the Russian Revolution, at least they learned one other thing, which is that it's important to hold that power and use it, at least for defensive purposes, right? What do you think?
It seems like there's a few different conversations. One of them is the question of freedom and like emancipation of society. There's the question of whether or not autonomous zones, or like autonomous politics or anarchist politics, are in some sense advancing the struggle for freedom, for social transformation. And then there's the other question, which is whether they can barely sustain themselves. Those are totally different questions. Maybe they can, but that's kind of has nothing to do with the question of freedom. Like, what, first of all. Second of all, I thought it was like very instructive that like, you were talking about them like existing within capitalism. I think that's like, I take that as like granted. So maybe they can like have like a sustaining, self-sustaining community of people within capitalism. But the point for like, I guess the premise of Marxism or socialism is like to try to get at something that's more socially general than just a community within capitalism that can like sustain itself, but something that can advance the problem of freedom for all of humanity.
Yeah. All right.
That's like.
Yeah. All right. Interesting. Thank you. Good.
But I don't know. That's like.
I guess I'll have to give it more thought. It's very eye-opening. Thank you. Both of your
More questions? Or even just comments? Like, feel free to comment.
Well, I have more to say about anarchism too. And just that, like, so I asked the question, in what way are they advancing this question of freedom, the question of progress? And And it seems like we have to kind of, that's like a real question for us to grapple with, like, are these questions advancing or not? Especially because they seem to be sort of repeating themselves. Like, going back to 1917, like, Lenin says in the lead up to 1917, like, there's like these twin, there's like the twin, how does he put it? He says like that we pay the twin costs for opportunism are anarchism and terrorism and economism. Anyway, I guess, so okay, there's just like long complicated history. The question is whether or not it's like, whether these questions are advancing or not. And it seems that we can look back at this history of failure and say, we can choose to say it doesn't matter. We can choose to say, like, this history doesn't matter to us, this is not relevant for us, we can ignore it. But then, like, nonetheless, like, the same kinds of questions keep emerging. And so there's this, like, that's a problem. To deal with. That would have to be dealt with politically.
Are you trying to say, like, that basically it wasn't necessarily, like, what could they have done differently in the revolution that might have allowed them to secure power? Like, over time, implement a fully, a well-rounded system that's not, what's the word?
I'd like to add to that question, is that I think you touched on your point, is that one of the failures is that the Bolsheviks and Lenin were dependent on the idea that Europe was about to burst into revolution, and that we were going to, in order for socialism to thrive, we would need an international community, and that just didn't happen. So that's, I'm similarly, and maybe we're all asking this question, you know, what could they have done differently? So maybe, like, what could the Russians have done to, besides, you know, what Stalin would do later, going in and messing, you know, kind of secretly and overtly in different countries to try to promote violent insurrections that didn't work. You know, what could the Bolsheviks have done to promote international conditions that would uphold revolution, that would have made that kind of dream possible?
So that's actually a rather complicated question because the Bolsheviks did do a lot. The issue was that there were certain political failures in Europe, particularly in Germany, where they didn't have a Bolshevik party. Rosa Luxemburg and Liebknecht tried to organize the Spartacus League at the last minute, but that was not coherent enough of a party to lead the revolution there. So, to some extent, the Bolsheviks were not just dependent on the idea, but the actual practice of revolutionaries abroad. And it was unique historical circumstances in Russia that had allowed the Bolsheviks to split. This is not to say that once the revolution in Germany failed, it was necessarily impossible for a world revolution. There were certain other factors that came to play, but ultimately the necessary type of party never developed outside of Russia. And there were probably some tactical errors that the Bolsheviks made. When you're trying to change the world and you're doing something completely unprecedented, yeah, you're going to fuck up in certain ways. I mean, maybe they botched the negotiations around the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in order to get out of the war. Maybe they mishandled the transporting of the Czech Legion, which led to a new, much more brutal stage of the Civil War. Like, this is just to say, like, sure, there were probably mistakes that were made, but the real factor was the failure of the international revolution, and that just wasn't quite in the Bolsheviks' control.
considering now the global, and in the next 50, 100 years, the global environmental destruction that's happening, that is going to cause most likely the biggest refugee crisis that we've ever seen from the coasts. Just people that are going to have to flee from their homes because of their proximity to the ocean. Or, we see in Southeast Asia, like the 2015 haze, that was just massive forest fires. And now we're seeing unprecedented rates of natural disasters, so on and so forth. There's so much environmental destruction. How can potentially that contribute to a worldwide declaration of anti-capitalism, or maybe a worldwide structure of similar revolutionary movements?
I mean, I do want to make the important distinction that in saying that the economic structure does not guarantee the inevitability of revolution, that's not to say that it doesn't create the grounds on which discontents form and on which people start trying to organize. So, environmental catastrophe, as it occurs, is likely to be a formative experience for many people and is likely to be a source of major discontents. But the question is still what form those discontents would take, what kind of political leadership would present itself, because discontents can end up reconstituting the capitalist system. So it's possible that the discontents created by the global environmental catastrophe that will unfold would just end up reconstituting capitalism if the needed socialist parties and organization is not there.
We'll just all convert to solar panels and we'll be okay. Yeah, so maybe a question to ask then is, how can we take this newfound global environmental dissatisfaction and turn it into potentially political worldwide growth? Yeah, I'm not saying, I don't know the answer to that, but
I can't say I know the answer to that either, but I would say there's a way to pose the question, because people are trying to discuss, make changes, and make activism based on the environment. The question is what that's doing, what it's working towards, or is it working, and how it's, of course, to ask how it's not working. In Platypus, we approach problems via negatively. We point to what doesn't work, mostly because that's all we seem to be able to find. So for the beginnings of answering the environmental problem, we would look towards how the present approaches are failing, contributing to the reconstitution of capitalism, or maybe not even getting far enough to matter in the first place.
So how can, how would it be possible for, a grand unification of people to try to change things up before, a mass crisis actually more or less destroys the world? Capitalism shows a great capacity for adapting, like you said. So, global catastrophe could literally be a catastrophe. You know what I'm saying?
So the question is, how can the kind of global organization of the proletariat form to deal with this problem and other problems in capitalism as a problem?
before we reach that point, before we reach the point where environment kind of forces some sort of change, even if it's the adaptability process. I think that's what you're asking, what can we do before we reach that point?
Well, in organizational terms, we often look back to the Second International simply because they came the closest. It was an international organization of socialist parties of which the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks were part. And they were arranged as an international in hopes of constituting the future world government. They were training the proletariat in the exercise of power, how to govern, how to take responsibility for society. So something that can perform those kinds of functions on a global scale would be needed to ensure a proletariat that can take responsibility for, say, moving to prevent a global economic or global environmental catastrophe.
So these have all been questions of like the nature of what to do, and you're right to put like the Second International as an example of a collective international effort of socialist working class parties to figure out what to do. And then the third international, the earlier question, you know, what could the Russian Revolution have done to be successful? That was precisely what the Third International was all about. Like as many people as possible, devoting as much effort as possible to figuring out how to actually solve the problem. And they did not succeed. And they admit, with the exception of liars, they admit they did not succeed, right? And then subsequent to that, there was the Fourth International, right, which was the Trotskyist effort to figure out solutions, and it also did not succeed, obviously, and kind of split up into a million pieces that also tried to figure out solutions, which they didn't get a grasp on things. There's one or two parties that are more significant than others, but they didn't get there. So I mean, a question I've often had for Platypus is, when does it become time to start, answering some of these questions or coming up? Because I mean, your knowledge of as an organization of negative points is very solid, right? Like, why did the Fourth International not succeed, right? There's plenty of things to discuss about that, but at some point, unless you reject the idea of an organized international, of a proletarian party, and so forth, then that seems to be the path of practice to actually accomplish these objectives.
So, one of the, in terms of the practical activity of Platypus, one of the things I think that we do that's really important is we host debates on the left. And the reason we do that is because there's take any issue of the day, and there's all these different kinds of left positions or left critiques you could imagine taking that issue. And so Platypus is this educational project, which is trying to open up these questions and open up points of disagreement to learn from them. If it so we're educating ourselves on these problems. I don't know that we can really say we know why the First International or Second International or Third International, Fourth International really failed. I mean, maybe we could say more about the First International, and we can maybe even say more about the Second International, but the Third International becomes more opaque and the Fourth International becomes even more opaque, and that's because it's we haven't surpassed them. It's there's a way in which the Second International clearly surpassed the First International, and the Third International also surpassed the Second International, or at least with 1917, that's clearly advancing the questions of social transformation, questions of freedom. But then they stopped advancing after that. At least that's sort of the Platypus read on history. Platypus doesn't really have much to say about present positions, but there's a lot to say about history. Okay, so what that means is that we don't what are the lessons of 1917? It's kind of this complex question, which lots of people today have answers to, and what we do is host them to talk about that because we think we can learn from them. But not because if it was this question of okay, so we know the lessons, then we could actually that would mean that we would know what to do, and we would have a party that we could form and join and make. But it seems we can only talk about that negatively, in the sense of what it wouldn't be. I wanted to say one more thing, two more things about anti-capitalism and about social breakdown. Those are the other two kind of themes that are out there. So first, it's definitely possible granted, we are facing environmental transformations that are happening because of capitalism, and that could very well mean mass refugee crises and war and all of these things. Would it necessarily mean the collapse of capitalism? Maybe, maybe not. And would the collapse of capitalism be a good thing? It certainly seems like right now, probably not. The capitalism collapsing in the face of environmental devastation seems to me more likely to be the sort of playing out of barbarism than the transformation to socialism. And again, this is going back to Luxemburg, the theorist in the Second International, who was just again going back to Marx and just saying, okay, we're confronted with these problems, and it seems more and more that the question facing humanity is socialism or barbarism. And if we're not really advancing this question, then all we're doing is sort of the falling into barbarism. And this collapse, the collapse of capitalism, at present, whether it's for environmental reasons or something else, doesn't seem to be progress. So that gets at both questions. And so in other words, that's getting at the point of anti-capitalism. It's the collapse of capitalism is not sufficient, because it could collapse progressively.
You talked about how, if we had, as leftists in America, a more solid idea outside of, negativity and self-critique, that we would join that party. So what do you think about the current state of the DSA? What they're upholding that we're the biggest leftist society in America since the Communist Party of America. And I don't necessarily disregard the DSA or support it, because right now I'm just not sure exactly what to do regarding that group. So if you're saying we would just join a group, why don't we join the DSA then?
The DSA is indeed the biggest leftist group since the Communist Party. But that it's big doesn't mean it's successful, and there's a lot of reasons between the actual internal culture of the organization since it inflated after the election of Trump, as well as its generally opportunist capitulation to bourgeois politics, to think that it's going to not really accomplish much and shrink.
Well, I think we definitely want to give the DSA a platform. We want to host the DSA. Exactly the thing, so that they can learn from themselves and we can learn from them, etc. So that, as a site of contestation. In terms of membership of Platypus, there's not you can be a member of Platypus and be a member of another political organization, including the DSA. So that's Platypus is an educational project, so it's sort of a separate entity in a way. But
Yeah, for sure. But it's not a party.
It's not a party.
Which is great. But
Yeah.
if we want to suggest a party, the biggest one right now is the DSA. So I guess all we can really do right now is give them a platform and
But
have
not-
open discussion.
Sure, but give them a platform along with other political parties, other left parties as well. So there's sort of three. If you look at the landscape of the left, there's sort of three boroughs. One of them is the academic left, and they're overlapping, sure. But one of them is the academic left. So these are historians and philosophy people and whatever academics that talk about left politics. Then there's the sectarian left. This would probably include the DSA, sort of, but also include the groups that you didn't mention. Hello, you're welcome to come in. We're talking about Marxism.
Oh, not wrong.
Okay. Bishop.
And what's the third one?
What? Oh, so right, and so then the third one is like the activist left, and there's like definitely overlap. Certainly, like the PSA engages in activism, and this is like a so those are three general groupings that we like try to have in productive conversation.
So I had a question that relates directly to what's just being said, which is that the DSA is indeed the largest organization of the left in the US, but why is the left the relevant category? Like your whole talk was framed around the left, right? And then shortly after your talk, we started, the working class proletariat cropped up. And as far as, at least I interpret Marx, Lenin, Marxism, right? The idea was that the fundamental division in capitalist society is one of classes, that our analysis should be based on a material analysis of classes, and that our political analysis follows from that, so that the fact that capitalists exploit workers is the key contradiction of society, and so the analytical category is not the left, but it is class, the working class, and the revolutionary working class, potentially. And you have all kinds of negative criticisms of the left, which are good. The left has, people with very questionable ideologies. The left has people who end up supporting fascists under certain circumstances and all this kind of stuff. But, that just to me suggests that the left is not really the point of attention, that we actually need a class analysis, we need working class organizations. And that, for me, is the answer to the question of the DSA, which is that there are a lot of people who haven't gotten past the idea that the left needs to be together in a big organization. And the organization that they've kind of flocked into, is one that supports the Democratic Party. And the Democratic Party is actually the better and stronger representative of the capitalists. It's the more effective evil, right? So, and we've got one particular kind of negative observation, which is that in the whole history of American politics, like associating with that lesser evil with the Democratic Party just makes people more demoralized, demobilized, and ultimately leads to the death of the left, so to speak. So the attachment to the category of the left, as opposed to socialists or working class revolutionaries, that's one of the key. And they actually do, I think, kind of have a positive answer to that. So then the DSA's out there. There's lots of people who should be in a socialist party or something within the DSA. So you speak to them, but not as on the premise that the DSA is doing the right thing, right? Just because it's big, it's already pretty clearly revealing its limitations, I think.
I think that one of the reasons that Platypus is right now mainly in the realm of asking questions is because, like you said, Marxist analysis based on class. In the days of Marx and Lenin and these people that we've been talking about, class struggle was happening, it was ongoing, and now we seem to not only be mostly in the absence of the left, but also in the absence of class struggle. And so, over the summer, for example, I was talking with a couple folks from down in West Virginia for a really good Trotskyist party. One of them had just run last year for State House in her district, and she got more than 1,000 people to vote for her, and they're down and knocking on doors, and that was kind of their criticism to me is probably we should be with the working class, this is where we should be, but at the same time, class struggle isn't happening right now, and their efforts, as great as they are and as great as they seem to be, are not true. There's no mass socialist party emerging from any efforts with the folks who are going door to door right now. So I think that's why, and like Gabe said, those are the kinds of people that we want to have come talk and we want to learn from. But it's definitely asking questions and learning.
I would expand upon that by saying the working class right now gotten rid of all of our industrial and our, most of our agricultural labor as well, and now also a lot of technological services like phone service, radiologies, stuff like that. That's gone to different countries. The working class in the United States has really been based on the service industry. It's on, mechanics, janitors, and stuff where you have to be face to face. Like there's a requirement that you're face to face in order to have a job in the working class in the United States, because everything else has been put in different countries, which to a certain extent, maybe that could create the potential for a mass international working class movement. But also, it also shows that we really can't rely on class divisions in America right now to spark some kind of revolutionary movement or to.
Why not? I mean, there are still like, there are maybe less, or they seem in a sense less prominent, but there are factory workers and agricultural workers still in the U.S. Maybe there's less. You could imagine, right, the question you asked I think is really good, like, well, you could also imagine that would make, like, international labor organizing even more important.
We also have to deal with the fact that capitalism, in fact, any economic system is constantly raising living standards, and even the lowest people is raising living standards. And that, to an extent, will also de-radicalize people. To that same extent, that technological, although that, yes, to that same extent, that technologization, that raising living standard, that's brought us to developments like penicillin and basic medicine that have brought us to the population crisis that we're in today, which, we're about 3 to 4 billion people away from the Earth's carrying capacity. Like, what's going to happen then? Maybe that will create some international class struggle, but I really think to focus on class divisions right now in America and think that will be the motivation for revolutions, I don't see that to me.
So I think the working class is struggling. To the extent that they can take time for politics, they're engaged in politics. It's not formatted as class struggles. It's not formatted under working class organizations, which could bring out the class character of the things that the working class is experiencing, which is, a lot of it is really terrible. They're being deported, they're being shot by police, they're being harassed in all kinds of ways, and so forth. And I don't think their living standards necessarily are going up. The amount that the working class needs to pay for rent to live in a place where there's a job is just astronomical.
Oh my God.
And it eats up so much and that ends up paying for, financial capital and all this other stuff. So I think
just to add to that,
Yeah.
sorry to interrupt you. I was reading this article from the 70s, and it was like, in the article it was talking about rent in Manhattan, and how the rent was like ungodly high, and like it was going up. And it was saying a teacher in Brooklyn who makes $30,000 a year, that's still like about what the starting salary of a teacher is, can barely afford to pay $500 rent a month in Brooklyn to house their family of 4. And that was what the article was saying. They can barely, they have stayed about the same since the 70s. And rent is not. No, I don't know. Look, there is a rent is too damn high party, and I guess people for that. But that's separate, actually. That's totally separate from the question of freedom and left politics. But it was just.
well,
I had to say that.
no. So Engels wrote The Housing Question, right? It's part of the socialist movement. It's part of the history of the socialist movement. And no other movement that I know of, really. The rent is too damn high parties. It's like a joke that exists because there's in a socialist movement, right? And so, you're kind of pointing to political economy. What's going to happen with the world working class? You have this internationalist kind of point to make. You know, the working class is increasingly divided, so production workers are in other places, and their conditions for political organizing might be even worse than what we have because of, you know, various things that are going on in those countries. But all that seems to point to me is that we're like politically underdeveloped, like we're politically way, way far behind where we should be, but we can do political economy, and we can like learn, and a lot of people do, we can learn about these problems. I mean, I know it's not the focus of the Platypus review, but I don't think you're excluding that, right? There's tons and tons of like interesting stuff to read about political economy that, you know, and people who ended up in the DSA, and they're worth hosting, right, to talk about, you know, what they're trying to figure out, how they're trying to learn, how to like get an organized world working class. Yeah.
I think the question is, what are the political conclusions that you can draw from that? That like, it's not the case that like the work, you know, living standards are just going up. It's not, since the 70s. But what are the political conclusions of that? It's also not the case that as living standards get worse, political possibilities increase. It's not the case either. And so like, no, living standards aren't really increasing, certainly for the working class in the US in the last 40 or 50 years. They're going down. Their outlook is worse. But also, it doesn't seem that political possibilities are greater either. I mean, in the like, maybe we're witnessing a transformation of neoliberalism right now, and like that's what Trump and Sanders and the turning and the crises within the Democratic and Republican parties are about, and that's like maybe a new political opportunity. Maybe. Yeah, but it's not the case that just like dismal outlook or lower working conditions means greater political possibility, and it's also not the case that like living standards are just improving for the working class.
I don't know.
I mean, if you just look in New York, sorry, just the last point. If you look in New York, like it's just for granted that like you can't live alone on a working class income. But it was for granted that of course you could and support a family on it 40 years ago. But it's like obviously you can't now, and that's something that's just been completely normalized. Okay.
I feel to a certain extent, you know, while our political economy and our ideas of politics are so far behind, capitalism is constantly requiring scientific and economic advancement to survive. Where am I going with this? I mean, like, I think to an extent that with the scientific developments, the genetic mutations that, not mutations, but genetic splicing that we've been able to do with basic substance like wheat, corn, and stuff that create shorter, faster growing plants that they can feed more people. And of course those face their own problems because those require twice the amount of pesticides, twice the amount of water. You know, maybe I'm interpreting that and the development of medicine, the development of all these technological advancements that would benefit even the poorest of people. Maybe that is being counteracted by the exploding population crisis. I guess maybe that's something I wasn't taking into account. I don't know where I'm going with that, but I guess I'm concurring with your point that, you know, do living standards really increase with technology and the higher availability of that if all these other social factors, the lag of political development, population explosion are also going to come into play?
I think I would say the most important aspect or outcome is not that the actual living standards have increased, but that it seems like things are better. You can point to certain things and say like, this has happened. Like, don't you see what we have now? And like things like that are, I mean, that's what I think of when I think of living standards increase. Like, clearly we're not living a better life, but we have things that kind of mediate that shittier life in a you know what I mean?
It's like an ideological question whether or not living standards have improved. And there's like this political aspect to it, and it's like, absence a left politics, it's like, I don't know, have they improved? Yeah, maybe they have. Even though like everybody's just taking it completely for granted that like the working class is gonna have to pack 5 people to a room. And it's not because there's too many people in New York. It's not because of population increase that rent has gone up. It's because living standards have gone down. People just expect that you're gonna have to share a room with 5 people in New York on working class salary. That's just an expectation. And it's like a question of politics too. It's like ideology. It's like, of course. It's like, what else would you expect? And that was like what was so funny about reading this article. It's like, what like, you know, it's like, what is this teacher gonna do? He can't support his family of 5 on $500 a month.
I wouldn't say that the population crisis doesn't necessarily contribute to higher rents and such, because I believe that the population crisis happened so suddenly that over, throughout the entire history of man since 40,000 BCE, at least, the start of the Neolithic, the Paleolithic, I get those confused.
In the last 10,000 years.
Yeah, the population has remained so stagnant, and then all of a sudden, within the past 150 years, we've seen a population of 5 billion people all around the world. It's absolutely unprecedented to so many economies, and the thing is that in the basic capitalist mindset is like, oh, if you can find a job, if you can get a wage, you can survive. That's not true at all, but that's what the capitalist mindset thrives on. And now that's been made so much worse by the fact that we have way too much population and not enough societal roles for them to fill. Like, we don't, with 7.5 billion people, we don't need 7.5 billion jobs, but that's what the capitalist mindset purports. That's what it suggests. So I would say that would, to an extent, contribute to like the raising of rents, lowering of wages, just because the demand for jobs stays relatively the same, especially with mechanization.
But it's an ideological question whether or not it's just that there's too many people, or that just people aren't worth anything to society. And those are ideological questions. And it's like, okay, well, people aren't really worth anything. And so it's like, they can just be like hacked to the room, or their lives aren't, like, whatever, all these things that have to do with like why living standards are going down in that sense.
So, I mean, the capitalists will exploit whatever happens to the extent that they're possible. So if the population increases, but it's, in a place like the U.S., there's not an effective resistance to exploitation, then the standards that you can expect the capitalists will find ways to drive living standards down just by their own competition, right, to get higher profits, higher rates of exploitation. I mean, like the two largest countries, China and India, it's not like there's like vast numbers of people who are completely useless to world capitalism, right? There's a surplus population or something. Like, they're being exploited. Like, they may not have the same levels of productivity as someone who's equipped with machinery or something, or in China, in many cases they are, and actually there's a labor shortage in many parts of China. So, like, capitalism can easily, find work for a huge number of people, and the only thing is that they'll keep doing it until, their genetic engineering somehow, results in one kind of environmental catastrophe or a global warming type catastrophe or something. But, I mean, should there be 7 billion people? Maybe there should be 10, I don't know. Like, I think socialism could easily feed far more people. We know of, if we had clean energy sources, we know of greenhouse technologies that could produce high quality food in huge quantities at huge productivities without even involving too many workers, So that means that basically we've got, 7 billion people with 20-hour work week or less, right? So that's great, And we can all think of ways to do it. It's
You
just,
also have to account for the idea of fresh water, though, which is, something that's very limited. That regardless provide twice the amount of fresh water that natural corn and wheat do, but they grow twice as fast, and that's why we can feed so many people. And I do believe, yeah, that the potential behind socialism is that you can have billions of people and then have shorter work weeks. We can easily provide for them. But I do believe that there is an extent to which our planet can hold.
Sure.
Yeah.
No, go ahead.
I mean, like, there is some number. Like, there is an integer. Like, maybe it's 100 trillion gazillion. I mean, are we there? I don't think so.
We're gonna be there soon.
Well, it's a function
Like,
of-
there's like all sorts of political questions there in terms of like how we mediate, how that question is dealt with. That question right now is just dealt with like, okay, like those people are worthless. Those people are not valued, and so they can die. And like whatever, like they're just kind of like tossed aside. And they also like provide a function too, which is like the reserve army of labor makes it so that like there's just like this like greater labor discipline and like more pressure on the existing working class. Like the London proletariat puts pressure on the proletariat in the sense of like there's like this economic play between them. But in socialism, like sure, in an emancipated society, how do we deal with population? Like this is like a totally different question that we can't even really start to think about. But yeah, like you could say, like quantitatively, like there certainly is some number, the number of atoms in the universe. Like there definitely can't be more than that. And you can find those smaller number too. There are bounds, sure. Are we there yet? I don't know. I mean, like lots of people for a long time have said we're there already, or we're almost there, and they've been wrong every time. Maybe. I mean, at some point that'll probably change. At some point in the future. It seems to me that it's not really like the most relevant pressing political question right now. It's not. It doesn't explain the problems that we're seeing.
I think actually, if you're going to
Because
consider any environmental, any political question, you have to take into account our population crisis right now. I mean,
It's not
based on our
because-
scientific knowledge, I mean, we're estimating that within the next 100, 200 years, we're going to reach a population of 10 to 12 billion people. And we really have no idea if we can sustain that. And so before we address
Well,
absolutely any political
The
issue,
present
I
society
think,
will just like be starving.
yeah.
That's horrible. But that's like what the present society will do.
And we know
It's not a
capitalism.
desirable thing.
No,
That's
yeah.
Capitalism will not come up with a solution to this. Like the population trends in capitalism will tend to some kind of disaster. We know that. I mean, but I can equally make the argument that capitalism forces people to have fewer children than they would wish to have that we could reasonably have. And like it doesn't go for every country, but if the population trend, the demographic trends of capitalist countries are reflected, then eventually capitalism will basically choke off the growth of the population of the working class simply by not paying them enough to support children. But I mean, either way, like the immediate problem is capitalism. Like you can't go to places where people have more children than the replacement population and say, like, you really need to get a handle on the population crisis because we're not going to be able to supply decent livelihoods for all of your children. Like they know that, but there's a reason that those countries are evolving in that way. So it's not like a point at which any class can kind of exert leverage and just say, like, everyone, first things first, let's like install solar panels and have fewer children, and then we'll have time to take care of capitalism once we've done those things. Because capitalism is going to force people to do all kinds of things that destroy the world before people can voluntarily have the luxury to preserve it.
People have less kids when they have wealth, or some wealth.
That's true. The developed nations of the world have declining population rates besides for immigration. And the country that has the most population But at that same point, what would you, and also I understand that.
We're out of time. That's what I've been dying to say for the past minute.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you.
Good till none.
Anyone want to sign up? Sign up sheets here.
What is it, I don't know, for?
Mailing list.
I already get emails, does that mean I'm already on?
Yeah.
That means you're unbelievable.